call the meeting to order. Thank you all for being here for our first public hearing of the new year. Welcome the committee back. Look forward to a productive year. And to kick it off, we're going to have a hearing talking about the threat that China poses, and most specifically how we can best counter that threat and deter what China is trying to do, and what should the Department of Defense's plan be for meeting the threats that China poses. And to discuss that question, we have three excellent witnesses with us this morning. I want to welcome back Michelle Flournoy, who's the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Andrew Philip Hunter, who is the Director of Defense Industrial Initiatives Group for CSIS, and Rear Admiral Michael McDevitt, U.S. Navy retired, a senior fellow at CNA, all eminently qualified for this discussion. And the bottom line is China is a threat to the basic international order. They don't play by the rules, and they attempt to set their own rules that really threaten international institutions and international norms. And we need to figure out how best to contain that threat and help get back onto the rules that we think that the world should be following. China's approach is autocratic to begin with. They don't believe in democracy. They do not obviously protect intellectual property, and they have a very detailed plan for expanding their influence in the world. And there's nothing per se wrong with that. They're a rising power. They are going to have greater influence in the world, but the way they're doing it is a fundamental threat to global stability. Just take the business example. They steal intellectual property. They do all manner of different things to try to undermine any sort of rules-based trade or business system. And then, of course, most notably, they are claiming territory that is not theirs throughout the Asian region and coming into conflict with more than a half dozen countries in their neighborhood and resisting any sort of international normal system of resolving those differences. Now, for the purposes of this committee, obviously, we have jurisdiction over the Department of Defense and the military, and what role does the military play in containing that threat? And one of my concerns as we look at this is we war game a lot of things out for how we would be able to win a war with China if it came to that, and I understand the utility from a deterrence standpoint. But in all likelihood, we're not going to be going to war with China. It's going to be more a battle on other planes. And if we're spending all of this money and all of this time and effort focused on that, what are we missing? What are we missing in terms of being able to build the alliances to stop the land grabs that they're doing down there, to protect intellectual property? And also, there's the simple matter of, we have scarce resources, and I know I talk about that a lot on this committee. I think it is a mistake to look at a problem and say, we can't be constrained by resources. We have to address the problem in any way we can. Everybody's always constrained by resources. And if we get into a very expensive arms race with Russia and China, while we're also trying to contain very real threats from Iran and North Korea and transnational terrorist groups, can we do that? Or does that undermine our ability to actually be an effective power in setting a different example than China has? So there's a lot of difficult questions here, and I have a lot to learn. I can't speak for other members of the committee, and I'm very pleased that we have three knowledgeable witnesses that will help lead that discussion and help educate us on what the best way for the Department of Defense to operate, what we should fund, and how we should go forward in terms of deterring Chinese aggression and dealing with the challenge and the competition that China poses to us. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry, for any opening statement that he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you that this is an excellent panel, and I appreciate all our witnesses being here today. I have learned from them and from the organizations with which they're affiliated or have been affiliated for a number of years. I also agree that a hearing on China is a good way to start the year. We have a national security strategy, a national defense strategy, national military strategy that places greater emphasis on great power competition. And I think what that means is we have to pay more attention to countries like Russia and China. Not that they're the only thing that we have to pay attention to, as events of the past week or two remind us. But if China is indeed the pacing threat, then part of the responsibility of this committee is think about the personnel and equipment and training that is needed to deal with that pacing threat. And the assumption, I guess, would be if we can deal with that, we can deal with other lesser threats as well. So I think this is a good way to start. And one other point, I've read all the witnesses' testimony. I think they have a number of specific items that this committee and this Congress can act upon this year that will help put us in better position to deal with the challenges coming from China. And so I hope that we can follow up on a number of the suggestions that they have. It's not just a theoretical thing, it's work for us in fulfilling our job under the Constitution this year. So again, I appreciate them being here and look forward to their testimony.
Thank you. Ms. Flournoy, we will start with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee. It's really an honor to be here, particularly to talk about this topic. I can't think of an issue that is more important to U.S. economic prosperity and national security over the coming decades than the question of the competition with China. As you all know, the strategic competition with China has many dimensions. I think primarily it's economic, technological, but there are also political, ideological, and military dimensions, and any successful strategy has to address all of those dimensions in an integrated way. We need a whole-of-government approach, a whole-of-nation approach, not just a defense approach to China. As we craft that strategy, we also have to remember that China will remain an important partner for us in key areas where we're trying to achieve our objectives, whether it's nonproliferation or climate change or North Korea. So we have to think about how do we compete while also maintaining possible areas of cooperation in areas of mutual interest. So I want to start by just highlighting 3 principles that I think should guide how we approach the strategic competition with China. The first and most important is that I think the number one thing we can do as a nation is to invest in the drivers of our own domestic competitiveness. Research and development, science and technology, incentives to get the private sector to increase their investment in key technologies areas, higher education, STEM education, broader access to that, 21st century infrastructure like 5G, smart immigration policy. So my point is, there's a lot we can do here at home that, frankly, I think the American people would welcome, that would do the most to position us well to compete against China. I think this is a moonshot moment. I think we need the national leadership, the call to action, and smart investment plans by this body to enable America to compete and win. Second, I think we have a huge strategic advantage in the network of allies we have around the world, not only in Asia, but in Europe and elsewhere. The best way to deal with the challenges posed by China is to do so by making common cause with our allies and partners wherever possible. We are infinitely stronger when we confront China together, when they violate the rules-based order or norms, etc. Third, I think we should still maintain our leadership role in protecting and adapting the rules-based international order that has served us and so many so well for so long, adapting that for the 21st century. We need to be at the forefront of upholding norms like freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of disputes in order to ensure that a might makes right approach does not take hold in the Indo-Pacific. Turning to the military, though, because I think that's where obviously this committee is focused, I think the challenge for the military is that we have to rethink fundamentally how we deter and, if necessary, fight and prevail in a conflict with China. America's military advantage is rapidly eroding vis-a-vis China in light of their modernization efforts. In fact, if we just stay the current course, a rising China will likely achieve overmatch in a number of key capability areas, undermining or at least calling into question our ability to deter effectively, to defend our interests, to protect our allies and partners, and ultimately to prevail at acceptable levels of cost and risk. So the number one military objective, in my view, is figuring out how to reestablish credible deterrence And as Representative Smith said, Chairman Smith said, also figure out how we're going to compete below the level of conflict. So in doing this, DOD faces several key challenges. I've laid them out in much more detail in the testimony, but I'll just highlight them here. China's substantial investment in anti-access area denial capabilities, which means that the United States can no longer expect to achieve airspace or maritime superiority early in a conflict. We will have to fight our way to gain it and maintain it as we have faced constant efforts to disrupt and degrade our battle management networks. Second, China's policy of civil-military fusion. They don't have something comparable to the gap between Washington and Silicon Valley in their system. They have civil-military fusion, which means any technology development of interest to the PLA goes to the PLA. We have to figure out what our answer to that is. It's not going to look like their answer, but we need to do a better job bridging that gap. And then finally, Doctrinal Innovations. They have come up with this idea of system destruction warfare, which means they will be looking to cripple our battle management networks, to use cyberspace attacks to keep us from ever leaving port, projecting power, basically keep us from ever reaching the theater, and so forth. So in the face of these challenges, we have to do a better job of really prioritizing what do we need to develop, acquire, and demonstrate. And we need to think in two time frames. In the near term, how do we think creatively about what we already have and use it in new ways, new concepts to reestablish deterrence in the next five-year time frame. Over the long term, we have to think more about how do we transform the force for a very different type of challenge in the future to dramatically increase the costs that any aggression would have. So investing in fundamentally transformational technologies. In terms of how we are doing, I think we are underinvesting still, even though, hats off to this committee for getting your bill passed, for really starting to move the needle towards the future. But still, we are underinvesting in the new technologies that will ultimately determine our success in deterrence. And we're still overinvesting in legacy platforms and weapon systems that we will not need or will not be as relevant. While we've made substantial progress in tech scouting and bringing some of those cutting-edge technologies in from Silicon Valley and elsewhere, there is still what I call the valley of death between the successful prototype and getting to be in the program of record for some of these new technologies. We are still lacking the technological talent that we need to be smart buyers and developers and fielders of new technologies. Nor have you've given the acquisition workforce tremendous new flexibilities in procurement authorities, but the department has not yet adequately trained that workforce or incented them to actually use those authorities fully and at scale. Mr. Chairman, I see the flashing light flashing at me. I've made 7 very concrete recommendations to Ranking Member Thornberry's point. I would urge you to look at those. I'm happy to walk through those if there's a question along those lines in the future.
It would be helpful, actually.
Okay, let me just do...
If you could do the Reader's Digest condensed version, I think
2 minutes on recommendations. Yeah. What do we actually do? So the first is I do think the department needs to implement a series of reforms in terms of acquisition, investment, and workforce development to really create the innovation ecosystem that we need to maintain the military's technological edge. Huge focus on training the acquisition cadre and incenting them differently. Huge effort needs to be taken to actually attract the technical talent that we need to do that. Lots of things that are already in place, like scholarships and debt relief to attract cyber talent. We need to broaden that to cover a much broader range of emerging technologies. Reforming the security clearance process is also a key part of that. I know that's a big windmill to tilt at, but we got to do that if we're going to get tech talent in the door to help. Second, ramping up our efforts to develop and test service-specific operational concepts to drive the rapid fielding of game-changing technologies. We have the concept of multi-domain operations. The services are starting to put meat on those bones, but this will require a continuous cycle of wargaming, prototyping, experimentation. Congress could help by providing the services with more robust funding to be able to field small numbers of emerging capabilities, prototypes, to develop early stage concepts, and to actually do robust fleet and field experimentation. Third, Department needs to be pushed to adopt best practices and lessons learned from the commercial technology sector in terms of how to do agile development. This is a new thing for the Department of Defense, and they need to get much better at doing that. There are ways to incent that. Fourth, budget realities, as you noted, are going to require some hard choices, both from the department and this body, to make the urgent trade-offs we need. One way I like to think about it, and I'd offer it for you, is we need to be thinking about, in every major platform area, where is the knee in the curve? Where does it make sense to forego the next, fill in the blank, aircraft carrier, tank battalion, whatever the amphibious ship, and instead take that money for that major investment in a legacy system and plow it into the emerging technologies that will make the legacy systems we have that are going to stay in the force for 20, 30, 40 years, that will make them survivable again, relevant again, effective again. The knee in the curve is where I think those trade-offs need to be made, and we need the analytic work to do that and the political courage to do that. Fifth, we need to continue to adapt and enhance our overseas posture to shore up ally and partner capability in a more contested environment. We can talk about what that might look like. Sixth, we need to shore up our near-term vulnerabilities. This is, again, not just focus on the emerging technologies that will help us in 10 years, but what are we going to do today and tomorrow with what we have in creative, new, asymmetric concepts to deter better today. Finally, the department needs to be much more active in setting norms and standards for emerging technologies and participating in security dialogues that set the new rules of the road. So let me stop there, and again, thank you for the extra time and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry, for the opportunity to testify today. It's nice to come home to the House Armed Services Committee. Applaud your decision to approach the topic of this hearing, what my colleagues at CSIS have called meeting the China challenge broadly. China is challenging the world and the United States militarily and economically. And while DOD's role is most significant in military domains, it has a significant role to play in the broader competition, especially in the key technologies that will form the commanding heights of future global markets. I'm going to focus my remarks on the ways in which the defense acquisition system can support success and competition with China. We very much agree with the remarks both the chairman and the ranking member made and Ms. Flournoy made about many other aspects of the competition with China that are incredibly significant. And I'd be happy to get into those in the questions. For the acquisition system, a lot of the roles that are going to be critical are very familiar. So the system will still need to be able to develop systems that meet exacting specifications that are required to operate in the most challenging conditions. And by that, I mean examples such as nuclear weapon systems and long-endurance undersea systems, large submarines, and unmanned systems, among others, where the defense requirements are so challenging that an off-the-shelf solution is not going to get the job done, and we need to develop systems unique to the military. That's a very traditional role for the acquisition system. System also needs to be able to pioneer breakthroughs in fields such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, directed energy, and hypersonic systems where fundamental challenges that relate directly to defense requirements remain. DOD can play a critical role not just on defense requirements, though, but also in support of the broader economy that is advancing these technologies, particularly in the art of testing and evaluation, where there are some fundamental limitations right now with these technologies. But in addition to these familiar roles, the acquisition system is going to need to be able to perform new roles in this competition. It must allow the U.S. to follow fast, understanding and catching up to breakthroughs achieved by the Chinese in key areas. The scale of their effort and their investment means they will get ahead of us in certain areas if they continue on course. But perhaps the most critical role for the defense acquisition system is building a strong connection to commercial technology providers so that DOD remains in touch with the cutting edge of technology. The competition with China features a struggle to shape and master global supply chains across a range of today's key industrial sectors such as semiconductors, networking technologies, including 5G, advanced materials, data analytics, big data, as well as key industrial sectors of tomorrow, such as quantum-based systems, intelligent systems, and synthetic biology. The defense acquisition system will need the ability to manage supply chains in a more complex business and security environment than ever before, and it will need to do so in a manner that does not divorce DOD from commercial suppliers. Now, China has developed structures for providing all of the defense acquisition capabilities I've described. China's progress in defense technology, however, is not supernatural. The U.S. and Chinese timelines for developing new purpose-built defense systems appear to be quite similar. China's advantages in growing defense resources, lower costs, access to technology shortcuts, is offset by weaknesses in corporate structure, manufacturing quality, and sophistication and experience. But the size and growth of the overall Chinese market serves as a key reinforcement function for its efforts, allowing China to progress despite sometimes deep flaws in the design and implementation of its programs, and to capture market power over key supply chains. This is why DoD's role must go beyond the purely military dimensions of the competition. As to what we're doing, DoD's adaptive acquisition framework appropriately creates multiple pathways to achieve the many objectives for the acquisition system I've described. But a key test will be DoD's ability to field and deploy capabilities developed through alternative pathways, something which has not yet been demonstrated at scale, especially for software acquisition. Something that I call an adaptable systems approach, which I can describe in more detail later, within the current adaptive acquisition framework would especially help DoD accelerate the deployment of new capabilities to fielded systems. Another key is the National Security Innovation Base, identified in the National Security Strategy. While the overall situation with commercial technology firms is one of increasing engagement, workforce issues are a challenge, as has been demonstrated multiple times. And the research university component of the National Security Innovation Base is deeply engaged with DoD, but has many challenges with foreign students and foreign researchers. This shows that management of human capital is one of the key issues in the strategic competition with China. The U.S. and DoD in our competition for talent, and industry as well, are in a competition for talent and must protect access to the best technical talent as a core asset. The clarity on key technologies provided in the National Defense Strategy is great, but while DoD's investments accounts have grown, this growth has been concentrated in existing production lines and prototypes of military systems. Investments in the NDS technologies have been modest by comparison, particularly given the fundamental science and engineering challenges that confront both DoD and the commercial sector. And China's aggressive use of cyber theft, counterfeit parts, has led to defense supply chain efforts that are valuable, but if poorly implemented, could unintentionally cut DoD off from access to commercial markets. A close and continuing dialogue with industry is required to build effective supply chain awareness and enable sound supply chain management. Finally, I recommend that the committee establish performance metrics for meeting the China challenge. At a minimum, such metrics should include the level of DoD investment in key NDS technologies and success in leveraging commercial research and development, measuring performance in developing and fielding purpose-built military systems, as we sometimes do or have done in the past, measuring DoD's engagement with different elements of the National Security Innovation Base, and measuring risk in DoD's supply chain.
Thank you. Admiral McDevitt.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry. It's my pleasure to appear before you today. I'm appearing in my personal capacity, and my comments reflect my personal views, not those of CNA and certainly not the U.S. Navy. Both the National Security Strategy and more recently the Indo-Pacific Strategy report from DOD say that China seeks to Indo-Pacific regional hegemony in the near term and ultimately global preeminence. Let me make a word or two about regional hegemony. China already militarily overshadows and intimidates its neighbors, especially if its army can walk or drive to their frontier. In every case, China is their largest trading partner. Economically, China's neighbors need China much more than China needs them. China has the ability to wreck their economies. These realities provide Beijing with tremendous regional, political, diplomatic, and economic leverage. It is important that the U.S. be comprehensively engaged in the region to reassure our allies and our friends, those that live in the shadow of China, that they have not been written off. That includes our military posture. Peacetime military presence is very important, as is continuing to demonstrate that we will fly, sail, or operate wherever international law permits. But we cannot forget that our friends and allies can also count. They understand that China is, after all, the home team, and its entire military is right there. Our regional first responders, like the U.S. 7th Fleet or the 5th or 7th Air Force or the 3rd Marine Corps Expeditionary Force, are numerically outnumbered. And we can't match them number for number. What we can do is try to improve our qualitative posture, especially in areas where we have a clear advantage, such as with our forward deployed submarine force. Submarines are our greatest operational advantage, and we should do everything we can to capitalize on that by increasing their day in and day out presence in the region. We should also take a look at capitalizing on the opportunity created by our post-INF environment to help offset the strategic rocket force unchallenged advantage that they currently enjoy. That means getting on with the planned deployments of Army land-based conventionally armed ballistic and cruise missiles in the Western Pacific. Importantly, China's ability to be militarily preeminent more globally beyond East Asia becomes much more problematic once its forces move away from China and are forced to operate beyond the umbrella provided by its land-based air cover or its ballistic missile forces. China is certainly not preeminent in the Eastern Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, or the Atlantic Ocean, but it is working on it. China is beginning to field a capable expeditionary force that could be used throughout the Indo-Pacific and along Africa's littoral. Marines, large amphibs, carrier air, logistic ships, et cetera, some of them are already in place and are growing. In response, DOD might offer assistance and encourage friends and allies to adopt a concept from the PLA and develop their own local anti-access area denial concepts to protect their own maritime approaches. Australia provides a good example today. General Secretary Xi's official goal for the entire PLA is he wants it to become world-class by 2049. Significantly, he wants China's ongoing modernization to be completed by 2035, which is just 15 years from now. He is in a hurry, and the military-civil fusion policy that China has implemented will ensure that the PLA has the benefit of any innovations, the technical breakthroughs that China makes will be able to contribute to the PLA. Neither Xi nor other senior officials have defined what world-class means. But world-class carries a connotation of second to none, or being top tier, or being the best in the world, and a global foundation to support a world-class military is already being laid. We know about the base in Djibouti, and that's probably the first along the Indian Ocean littoral. As of today, as part of China's naval buildup, it has commissioned or launched over 130 modern blue water, I'm just talking about blue water, warships that are capable of operating throughout the Indian Ocean, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, and remain on station for months at a time. Today, this is far and away the second largest and most modern blue water navy in the world. DOD should become encouraged to become more outspoken about China's world-class military ambition and specifically address what does that mean for U.S. security. A section in its annual report to Congress that addresses the world-class military would be a good place to start. In conclusion, the long-term challenge to important U.S. national interests come from China, and we must adopt a long-term plan to address this challenge. It should be a whole-of-government approach, as Ms. Flournoy mentioned. Central to this, DOD must be able to count on a predictable level of funding, whatever you decide it is. I'm not sure what that number is, but it should be predictable that the department can count on day in and year in and year out. In this regard, the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative that has been authorized but not funded awaits a DOD input as to how that money would be spent. And I encourage you to encourage DOD to get on with providing the requested funding plan so that this initiative can move forward. DOD also needs a China strategy for the long term. I think a reasonable starting point is the aforementioned 2019 Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. Now, trust me, this is a far from perfect document. It's too glossy, it's too long, it seems to be more about public relations than strategy, but it does lay out some sensible strategic concepts. I suggest that it be recast, shortened to not more than 10 pages, vetted on Capitol Hill, and approved by the White House, not the acting Secretary of Defense, as this one was. In the interest of time, I have not mentioned China's ambitions in space, its concept of military-civil fusion only in passing, or its military modernization and global influence ops. And I can address those in your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move into the questions. For the witnesses' information, we try to keep everyone to 5 minutes, and that means that the whole time should be 5 minutes. The whole, ask the question for 4 minutes and 59 seconds, then get a 5-minute answer. It's inconvenient because I don't want to cut you off in mid-sentence, but the people down in the bottom row start sending me texts if I don't, because they want to get a chance to ask a question. So if you see the 5 minutes go off, if you could wrap up quickly so I don't have to interrupt you, that would be greatly appreciated. Admiral McDevitt, just quick example, what are we spending money on at DOD? If you look at it from the perspective of what you all just said about the threat from China and having that China-centric focus, can you give us an example of something that we're spending money on at DOD that we shouldn't be, and then something that we should be? Okay, you look at this problem, okay, we're not addressing it here, clearly shouldn't be doing that, we should be doing this instead. Do you have a concrete example of that that would help guide us, basically?
Actually, I'm probably not the person to ask what we should or should not be spending money on, but what I would suggest to you is, looking at the future, I have been struck by the fascination with hypersonic weapons, and I think we need to be sensible about that. At the tactical level, hypersonic makes a heck of a lot of sense. You can shoot somebody very quickly before they can shoot back. At the strategic level, we have hypersonic weapons. They're called ICBMs. And we don't need any more hypersonic. And so if we're going to focus on hypersonics, we got to focus on what is tactically usable. The second thing I think I would suggest is keep in mind, if you want to establish or reestablish deterrence, that China is becoming as dependent as we are on space, cyber, networks. And so without their ability to surveil the open ocean, they can't use their anti-ship ballistic missiles. They don't know where to vector the diesel submarines. They don't know where to launch our land-based aircraft in what direction. So we should not wring our hands and say that it's too hard. All we have to do is make that system not work.
Yeah. No, I think you actually are a very good person to answer that question. That was very helpful. Thank you. And building off of that last point, this is something that Ms. Flournoy pointed out. The command and control issue, I think, is one of the biggest issues facing us going forward. When we talk about investing in new technologies versus investing in legacy systems, a lot of times that can get blurred and not actually mean anything. But I think the biggest thing that it means is in this area, because everything we have now is dependent upon that command and control system. And as the Admiral just pointed out, same goes for China. If we can take down their command and control system, that's an enormous advantage. If we can protect our own, same thing. What are the keys? And you mentioned a lot of different reforms and different pieces, but if you had to mention, any one of you, one or two things that's the absolute key to winning that command and control battle, what do we need to invest in to be able to defend our own systems and to invest in to take down an adversary system? Mr. Hunter, why don't you go ahead and start, and then Ms. Flournoy.
Yeah, so where I naturally first go when you ask that question is the idea of really doing software acquisition well, being able to build robust, resilient networks, because both in the offense and the defense, it's about taking down the networks that both sides have developed to pass information to do command and control. So it's about the cybersecurity of those networks, and it's about the ability to rapidly adapt those networks as technology evolves and as we see the kinds of attacks that are likely to be posed on our C2 systems. And this is an area where we really struggle. And we struggle because, as Ms. Flournoy mentioned in her testimony, we are struggling to adapt some of the agile development techniques, DevOps techniques that have been successful in the private sector. And in some cases, it's our bureaucratic structures that make that so hard. For example, the budget structure, the way that we do building of budgets makes it very hard to say, we've got this budget for for doing upgrades and new features on our software system, but we don't know yet which features we're going to select. We may have a menu of 20, but at the end of the day, 5 are going to be the critical ones, and we won't decide that as we're building the budget. We're going to decide it when we start to write code, and are trying to write that code very quickly in weeks, not in years. So that would be something I would highlight.
Okay, Ms. Flournoy.
I would agree that building the advanced battle management system that the Air Force and the Department are talking about is really the long pole in the tent for the vision of multi-domain operations. It will require rapid advancements in sensor integration, data processing, artificial intelligence, network connectivity to all the different shooters and actors, and cloud computing. These are all areas where the department has to let itself learn from the private sector companies and entities that have really pioneered these technologies. We have to get much better at spiral development, creating prototypes that enable substantial feedback and interaction from operators before we move forward to further specify requirements. This is not something where you can architect it from the top down perfectly, take 5 years to define requirements and then build to that the way we do. This has to be a spiral development process where you're going to learn and adapt along the way. But it means that the department has to change, but also how defense industry works has to change. We have to move towards much more open architectures and much more iterative agile development. So that is the long pole in the tent. The thing that you all can do, I think, most importantly, the services are asking to shift money to these efforts, whether it's the Air Force moving $9 billion towards this, whether it's requesting your help for spiral development and experimentation. These are things that it's tough because it's taking money away from legacy programs, but we've got to move serious money into this area if we're going to make progress on the time and scale that we need to.
Yeah, and I just said the challenge there, of course, is shifted from where, because that's when everyone's like, you got to take it. It was no, not from there, not from here, not from there. That's the tougher part of the choice that I think we need to focus on. But I just want to emphasize, and I appreciate your testimony emphasizing it. It's crucial that we do that. That shift has to happen. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get a little bit more specific on 3 ideas, one from each of you, kind of, that I just plucked out. Admiral, one of the points you made in your written and your oral testimony was funding the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. We authorized that several years ago under kind of a thought that, well, it's working pretty well in Europe. Why not look at doing it in the Pacific? And yet it has never been funded, and I don't think the department has taken it particularly seriously. But can you elaborate just a little bit? Is this worth fighting with them over? What are the benefits?
I personally think that there are great benefits for the Indo-Pacific commander. And if I'm not mistaken, I came across an article or something that showed up in the press anyway from Indo-PACOM, in which there were a whole list of initiatives that they were talking about wanting to have funded. Why they have not turned that into a budgetary request is beyond me. I don't know. My recommendation would be to rattle their cage, quite frankly, and say, tell me why you're dragging your feet on preparing. Take a look at what UCOM has done and copy it, for goodness sake, and give me a plan on how you intend to use these dollars.
Yeah. I think the answer is what the chairman said. Everybody's afraid they're going to rob their piggy bank in order to fund this, but
that goes on every day in the building.
Yeah, we just have to fund it. Mr. Hunter, I was going to ask you about something else, but I want to follow up on software because we hear that a lot. And both you and Ms. Flournoy have talked about the people part of software, attracting the right people, and maybe that's the only answer, but is there some other concrete step we can do this year that would push the department forward on having its own software capability?
I think there are. And again, I didn't want to harp too much on the budgetary piece, but I really think it is critical because, as was mentioned, and as this committee well knows, there have been a huge number of flexible authorities provided to the department for things like contracting, doing contracting quick, removing bureaucracy from the acquisition process. Where we haven't done really almost any of that is on how to use money to actually support those approaches. So it's still the typical programming, budgeting, planning, appropriating cycle. And ways we get around that, we have reprogramming authority that allows us to move money. A huge piece of that is chewed up and churn on just recoloring money from procurement to R&D, from R&D to procurement, from O&M to one of the other colors, because the thing you need to do is not the thing you thought you needed to do 2 years ago when you built the budget, is not the thing you need to do in the year of execution. And I think a lot of that churn can be minimized by simply opening the aperture a little bit on these fuzzy lines between what is R&D, what is procurement.
Okay, so you're not talking about a fund for software development. You're talking about program by program, a little more flexibility so that
Exactly. And to be clear, I like the idea of a fund for software development, but I know it could be a real challenge. I think we can do something very concrete with clarifying some of the reprogramming needs, eliminating some of them with color of money, and then secondly on new starts. It is trying to think of a polite way to say it. No one knows what's going on with new starts. There are 15 different definitions of what they are, and people tend to take the most conservative approach, which means that they're constantly holding and waiting for approval on things that should be moving out.
Yeah, no, and CRs emphasize that because no new start.
They
Ms.
completely
Flournoy,
cancel.
I want you to talk to us a little bit more about bridge funding, because you have talked about we're doing better on experimentation, we're, some of these areas, but still there's a valley of death going between an experiment and making it real, having somebody, some service pick up the ball and run with it.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate on that?
I think the first thing is to try to get services directly engaged as sponsors early in the game. This is working through SBIR's contracts. That's actually working. DIU's doing a better job of having service sponsors alongside them, so there's a sense of ownership from the start. But in terms of bridge funding, what I'm finding talking to a lot of tech companies who actually want to work in the national security space, they want to help DOD, is they have a great experience through SoftWorks or DIU or whatever, getting to the demonstration phase. They win the prototype competition. Great, we love you. And that's in like FY19. And then they're told, okay, we're going to submit an we're going to have an RFP for you in 21. And they're like, okay, but what do I do in 20? I've got a 10-year hole in my business plan, and my investors are pressuring me to drop the work on DOD because it's too slow, it's too small dollars. You can make more money in the commercial sector, just to drop it. And so we've got to figure out, there's got to be some areas where we know we've got to attract commercial industry, whether it's AI or cybersecurity or quantum computing or 5G or whatever, to have some bridge funding where you can take the winners and continue to invest in them, developing things until you get to the big RFP where they can compete at scale. Because what's happening is a lot of companies who try, they get stuck and their investors pressure them to pull away. So that's the concept. If I could just say, I also endorse putting some software development monies into each of the services and then requiring them to report on how they're implementing agile development processes. If you couple that with some smart tech talent efforts to bring in mid-career people from the tech field for tours of duty, people who have experience in software project and program management, and you couple that with educating national security leaders how to manage that tech talent, create more viable career paths for them in the public sector. And, oh, by the way, again, reforming the security clearance process. Right now, you have, again, tech talent who wants to serve, and they're told they got to wait a year. and they end up saying, hey, I gotta have a job. I can't wait. And the biggest barrier for them right now is security clearance process.
Yes, ma'am. We hear that all the time, too. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I want to commend your really very strong attempt at a comprehensive look here. I think we just feel like, trying to really pick from that where we can be the most effective is really a key. Ms. Fauna, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the civil-military fusion issue, which we're very well aware of. And, I think the question really is, so what should our civil-military fusion look like? And maybe the other question is, what should it not look like? Which may be pretty much what we've been doing all along. We have a different system, obviously. We're not going to be China in this at all. We don't want to be. So where do we go from here with that?
So the Chinese approach would not work for us, which is fine. But I think the DOD has to do a better job of appealing to our tech community in terms that they understand and respond to. So one of the best ways to get tech talent and military folks or DOD folks working alongside is through challenges, to say, we have a problem, and we want the best talent from across the board to come and work this problem set together. And at the end, there's either prize money, or there's a contract, or there's a way forward to take this solution into further development. That is a language that universities understand, tech community understands. So we need to do a better job of reaching out and engaging.
Part of my question would be, why haven't we done that? What is it?
We've done it at a very small scale, but we're not doing it at scale and across the board. Systematically removing some of the barriers for tech talent to serve that we've talked a little bit about. I'm actually working on a study on this right now, and we'll be happy to come brief you all informally when we're done. But I also think, using a scalpel and not a sledgehammer with our own industry. So I'm all about protecting our crown jewels, national security technologies. I'm all about making sure we are very careful about the kind of Chinese investment we allow in our tech community. But right now, there's an environment of extreme risk aversion, such that I fear we are actually cutting off things like completely passive investment that gets no access to IP, no controlling interest, no board seat, no ability. It's just money flowing through the bloodstream. There are some CFIUS calls that I think are being made badly, that are going to hurt us by cutting off money for our industry. There are some export control examples where old technology licenses that have been granted for 20 years, suddenly they're being disapproved not because the technology is relevant to the Chinese military, or because it can be reversed and engineered, or because there's any real IP theft threat. It's because someone in the bureaucracy is afraid to approve anything going to China. And so I worry we are creating an environment where we're going to hurt our own industry if we're not careful. So I just sound that as a cautionary note.
How do you think we can best oversee that, to sort of catch it in process?
I think making sure we're highlighting Andrew's point that yes, there's a military dimension of this competition, but fundamentally, this is an economic and technological competition, and we need to consistently be looking at any trade-offs we're imposing for our own industry in their ability to compete. And so I think having people digging into this, what are the right ways to protect the supply chain versus the heavy-handed, stupid ways to do it?
Sledgehammer ways,
and get people into the details, and to hear from you that you're not going to haul them up here and punish them if they make more nuanced, thoughtful judgment calls.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
I just wanted to make a quick. When you asked your question, Congresswoman Davis, you talked about civil-military fusion. In China, it's military-civil fusion. And that order of words is very important, because in China, the companies that are doing the technology and the innovation, they don't have a vote. They must cooperate.
Yeah, big difference. Yes, thank you. Mr. Hunter?
I just wanted to say we should also understand that China's push towards military-civil fusion, they're actually seeking to replicate what they see as the U.S. model. You know, they look at Boeing and they say, we want something like that. We want a leading aviation company that is also our military aircraft supplier. So we aren't so terrible at this, right? There's a background here where we do know how to do this. We have been effective at it. I think where we're really challenged to do it is with companies that haven't worked closely with the Department of Defense.
I am sorry, this
Thank
is
you.
that moment. The gentlelady's
Mr.
time has
Chairman.
expired. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you for calling this very important hearing. And we look forward on Friday to providing a very warm welcome to Chairman Smith to South Carolina. And I appreciate each of the witnesses today. And Secretary Flournoy, I appreciate you pointing out that we can be partners. America and China have been partners in the past. My dad served in Flying Tigers in World War II in Xi'an, Chengdu, Kunming. And I'm really grateful that it was Chinese and American forces together to resist aggression at that time. And still today, there are monuments across China recognizing the U.S. Army Air Corps, what they did to save millions of Chinese lives. And so this is appreciated, and we hopefully can build on that. And Admiral McDevitt, I want to thank you for your 34 years of service for the Navy. We're also thankful for President Donald Trump's leadership and the bipartisan support of Congress to pass the NDAA, the signing on December the 20th for the 58th consecutive year to protect our country. And a question, Admiral. This week, Admiral Michael Gilday, the Chief of Naval Operations, said the Navy needs more funding to compete with China's growing Navy. This is at a time when the goals are presented in coordination with the National Defense Strategy as we transition to a great power competition. What ways should the Department of Defense offset China's growing naval fleet in the anti-access area denial strategy?
Well, I've addressed some of the anti-access already about figuring out a way to make sure their anti-access surveillance, the piece of it, doesn't work. In an open environment, probably that's about as far as I want to go. The other part of it is numbers do matter, and so I think the Navy's enthusiastic about the administration's 355 ship goal. Now, the reality is whether we ever get there or not, I think the acting Secretary of the Navy has been clear that he's worried about efforts to rush the 355 to get to it before, I think the original year was 2034, which coincidentally, by the way, is when China in 2035 is saying that their military modernization will be completed. We don't know how big their Navy is going to be. It's a state secret. And so, and they won't tell. At least they haven't told me and a lot of other people who have asked or trying to find out. They may not even know. But it's going to be big. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and you know, that's become a parlor game, I think. But about in 2035, about 420 ships. It's not all blue water, but I mean, that's about, so it will be the largest Navy in the world. There's no way we're going to have a bigger Navy, period, full stop. So we have to have a better Navy. And part of that is readiness improvements, and part of that is continuing along with the plans, for example, on I know the LCS is not the greatest ship in the world. I guess I can speak candidly there. There's a lot of critics of the littoral combat ship. But we own 25 or 35 of those things now, and we ought to do the best we can for making them effective, as opposed to just writing them off and saying, well, we'll get something better. And so, because otherwise, we can't even count them in terms of being a credible combat warship. So those are the things that strike me as I'm not in a position to comment on what type of ship this, ship Y, ship X. Whatever we build, though, it ought to be able to survive, and it ought to be able to have an offensive punch that we can actually fight and win successfully.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Hunter, since 2004, China has established Confucius Institutes at American universities at over 100. some close to the proximity of our technology centers. Do you see this as a problem for our country?
Well, I think anytime that you have a situation where academic freedom is being constrained, that has real implications for national security, because fundamentally open research is what provides that foundation for the technological advances that we're depending upon, both economically and for the military. So Confucius Institutes tend to be focused more on IR and political science type issues, but I do think that injecting that sort of element into that the academic environment does have risks. There was just a Jason's report that came out in the last couple of days where they've been evaluating how do we have the right kinds of research collaboration.
Apologize, but the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Has expired. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses for being here this morning. Ms. Flournoy, when you started out, again, I was pleased you were framing the question of that region of the world, that our mission should be to create common cause, to stand up for rules-based order and norms. I think one of the biggest glaring shortfalls we have as a country is, again, that we still have not ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, which, again, every commander serving in the Indo-Pacific region, and Admiral Davidson, who's there now at his confirmation hearing, called on Congress to move forward to do that. His predecessor, Admiral Harris, now Ambassador Harris, was almost militant on the question of the need to do that. He was quoted as saying, "I think that by not signing onto it, we lose the credibility for the very same thing we're arguing for, accepting rules and norms in the international arena." And the biggest court case or maritime ruling against China, the Philippines case, the U.S. was actually denied not only party status, but observer status. We had to rely on Australia to be our proxy during that proceeding, and China definitely sort of throws it back in our face anytime that ruling is cited, certainly by us, that, well, you're not part of this. So, there's now new issues like rare earth mineral seabed mining, which is now a gold rush out there in the Pacific region, which, again, we are shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of not being able to be part of a legal framework so that we can not allow China to overreach in that area. Again, I just sort of, we have a House resolution, by the way, calling on the Senate to move forward on this, H.R. 454, which is bipartisan. I was just wondering if you could comment.
No, I agree. It's not only ironic but damaging that the primary rules that we use our ships and our forces and our diplomatic clout every day to enforce come from a treaty that we haven't ratified, and that I do think it undercuts our standing on this issue somewhat. I think it would be very powerful to get that treaty ratified. We're already spending lots of mind share and resources to enforce it. We should have the benefits of being a full party to the treaty. There are absolutely no downsides that I see to that whatsoever.
I just wonder if the other witnesses could just sort of comment on that point.
Topic near and dear to my heart. Absolutely, we should ratify it. It's important to keep in mind that at some point in the future, I don't know when, there's probably going to be another UN-sponsored commission to look at revisions and updates to the Law of the Sea Treaty, and we're not going to have a seat at the table. We played a huge role in the first extant Law of the Sea Treaty in terms of helping shape the debate and getting concerns of the maritime powers on the table and what have you. If we're not there, the next time around, it will be the Russians and the Chinese who will essentially be in charge or be the leading voice in those negotiations.
I also agree, and I think your point about seabed mining raises the fact that these kinds of international agreements help to shape where global markets go. in technologies that are developing and resource extraction technologies that are coming online. And so I would point, if we can't do law of the sea, I think it presents challenges for us in areas like space, where there are inevitably new international agreements coming with the explosion of commercial space. And if we don't make ourselves an active party in that, we will disadvantage ourselves in this competition with China.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Thornberry's question on the Asia Reassurance Initiative, which, again, passed unanimously last year. Was signed into law, actually, right around New Year's Day last year, so it's about a year old. I mean, in the meantime, we have seen this administration getting into a food fight with South Korea about wanting a 5-fold increase from Korea. And I mean, there is such a disconnect in terms of what Congress called for, which is to boost investment in that part of the world, and then what policies we're seeing play out publicly by the administration. I just wonder if you could comment on that sort of contradiction.
Yeah, no, I do see the contradiction, and I think we are, South Korea actually makes one of the largest contributions relative to other allies that also host U.S. troops than any other country. I mean, they are a very good partner in terms of financial support as well as military and operational cooperation. So we should not be beating them about the head and shoulders on this issue.
And I'm sorry,
I'm
again,
sorry.
maybe that's
Okay.
the record, but the gentleman's time has expired, and I want to make sure I get to everybody. Mr. Turner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Flournoy, thank you for being here. Good to see you again. Appreciate your continued contributions to policy and the discussions of our national security. In reading your testimony, one of the most important themes throughout it is the issue of deterrence. What does the United States need to do to continue to deter China? You raised the issue of the technology. Obviously, their surveillance society represents a threat with Five Eyes and our allies and backdoor opportunities for China to freely access our data, our information. Certainly, they've been very forward-leaning in their hacking activities with even the OPM records that were being taken of federal employees attributed to China. And then we look at technologies, and on page 2 you said, China is investing tens of billions of dollars from hypersonics and robotics to quantum computing. And for example, hypersonics is not really modernization. That's new technology. And we've fallen short in that. In fact, they've stolen a lot of what has allowed them to advance. I'd like you to talk for a minute about deterrence and what we need to do. As they have hypersonics, most of our Chinese strategy has been basing in the area. As you point out in your testimony, their ability to hold us at bay or access or threaten our troops in the area are land or sea-based, is based upon the new technologies. What do you see in our opportunity for hypersonics that may also hold them at bay? Do you think that they see, as we fall behind technologically, that they have an edge that could give them the ability to be adventuresome in the area?
Yes, I think that that's what they're hoping for. And I guess this connects to this. I think that numerical targets like 355 ship Navy, X number of Air Force squadrons, those are the metrics of the past. And if we if we hold to those, we will get this wrong. That is not the right measure. The right things that we should be measuring are the time and scale of outcomes we can achieve that contribute to deterrence. So can we hold the Chinese fleet at risk, at scale, in a 72-hour period? That's a pretty strong deterrent. So what does that look like? In the near term, it may be cobbling together. It may be putting a Navy munition like El Razum on a bunch of Air Force B-2 bombers. It may be, in the longer term, it may be the Army playing a totally new role, or the Marine Corps, of fielding distributed, long-range artillery missiles, perhaps some of them hypersonic, across the Asia-Pacific that are outside the Chinese threat ring but can hold those ships at risk. I'm not suggesting we sink, the Chinese fleet in one day. What I am suggesting is that if we could say to them, if you undertake this act of aggression, you are putting your entire fleet at risk immediately. Do you understand that? That might be pretty good for deterrence. So we really have to rethink our metrics to look at what are the outcomes that we can achieve that would really meaningfully help deterrence. That's what we should be measuring ourselves against, not the size of different parts of the force structure.
Two quick things.
Yeah.
Russia is again not modernizing their nuclear forces. They're actually deploying new capabilities, hypersonics, Skyfall, Poseidon. China is looking, obviously, for a nuclear option for their new hypersonics capability, which are all first strikes capability. One, do you see an opportunity for us as we see Russia breaking out from our nuclear limitations agreements to be able to include China and try to lessen the arms race that we're obviously well behind in? And secondly, with there wouldn't be a nuclear North Korea but for China. What should we be doing to encourage China more on North Korea?
Wow. Okay. On traditional arms control with Russia, I actually think we want to extend START, keep that cap in place because it does constrain a lot of things. It does give us, verification, intelligence, et cetera. And we don't want to reopen those areas of competition. But in these other areas, new technologies like hypersonics, like cyber, like space, where they will have an impact on the domain of strategic stability, we absolutely should be having bilateral and multilateral discussions with the Russians and the Chinese to can we take certain really catastrophic scenarios off the table? Like we do not want to go there because it would be very bad for you and it would be very bad for us. So can we just put that aside? Now, we won't succeed in everything, but I think exploring that area of how new technologies affect strategic stability is really, really critical.
And again, I'm
yeah,
sorry, the
sorry
gentleman's
we
time
can't get to North
has
Korea.
expired. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Flournoy, in your prepared testimony, you mentioned that the U.S. should leverage the unique strategic advance of having many allies and partners around the world, but that this administration has departed from that approach. I agree with you and believe that the departure from previous administrations' focus on a multilateral approach to China is undermining our long-term success. How else do you see, or would you say that this administration has diverged from the approach of the previous two presidents?
Well, I think that the administration has paid a lot of attention to one metric, which is what allies contribute financially, and they've sort of embedded the military contribution inside a discussion of trade deficits. I think that's way too narrow a view. We have to consider that an organization like NATO declared Article 5 for us after 9/11. They came to our aid. We would not have had the troops we needed in Afghanistan if NATO didn't pony up 40,000 troops. We have allies and partners who have fought and died alongside us. That sacrifice, that willingness to be there. Look at Australia, who's come, no questions asked. You're going, you're asking, we're coming with you. I mean, that should count for something, not just the financial dimension of the relationship. And the problem is, there's no national security problem that the United States can solve, no matter how powerful we are, alone. We need allies and partners. And so I would really endorse your committee's efforts to say, how do we really leverage a more strategic approach to security cooperation and investing in allies and building their capacity, their ability to defend their own sovereignty throughout Asia? I think that is a really important project for the future.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter, how much of the U.S. reemphasis towards hypersonic development comes from meeting a warfighter requirement or pure competition with China and their development allegedly being ahead of the United States?
Well, the U.S. has been pursuing hypersonic systems for quite a while, but it's been a very slow pursuit. And so what happened is the Chinese made a very quick effort, and so they've been able to demonstrate some things that we had not as yet demonstrated, but the core of the technology was really developed in the United States. And if we choose to commit significant investment dollars I think we can make equally rapid progress to them going forward. I think you ask a really good question, which is what combatant commander need does that capability fulfill? And it could vary differently across different regions. To my eye, it does look attractive in the Indo-Pacific because of the ranges that are involved there. Other systems have a hard time reaching the fight from secure areas. And so hypersonic systems do seem pretty promising there, but I wouldn't want to get out ahead of the PACOM commander, Indo-PACOM commander, in making that judgment. It was referenced in an earlier point with the security fund about how do we help spur on meeting the Indo-PACOM commander's requirements. A big piece of what that has been over the last several years has been the Strategic Capabilities Office. A lot of their initiatives came out of Indo-PACOM combatant commander requirements. So I am concerned that there's been an effort to kind of divorce what SCO is doing from combatant commander requirements. I think that tie is really important to us delivering a set of capabilities in the hypersonic systems area that actually have utility for the warfighter. I think you really need that connection. And let me just say on your question about the alliances, we have a very robust set of defense industrial cooperation alliances with the Republic of Korea, with NATO allies, with Australia, and it's key to a lot of these technologies that we're talking about. Samsung is a world leader in microchips and 5G. The Australians are world leaders in quantum computing.
Let me get another question in before my time's up. What drives the U.S. need for hypersonic weapons, and how is this driver different or the same for China in developing hypersonics?
I think part of the answer is that we need a diversity of approaches to solve the operational problems that we have in the Indo-Pacific. So I do think hypersonic systems give us options in the case of a high-intensity fight that we wouldn't currently have. So I don't know that they're going to be necessarily critical to victory or failure, but they definitely open up a space that can operate, with a deterrence function to make the Chinese doubt that they might be able to succeed in some of their more aggressive plans that their military writers have written about that they could engage in those island chains.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Inspired, Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly agree with you, Mr. Chairman, when you talked earlier about our resources are not infinite. With that in mind, I'm so glad that we have a strong economy, record low unemployment. There's a direct correlation, in my opinion, between a strong economy and a strong defense. The stronger the economy, the stronger the defense, and that's why we can have these well-funded budgets of last year and next year. So let me follow up on the great questions and the great answers already on hypersonics. And Ms. Flournoy, let me ask you, we tend to concentrate on the offensive capability of developing our own hypersonic fleet, but what about the defensive capability of using missile defense type technologies to cast doubt in the minds of the Chinese if they ever consider a potential first strike, and to show that those plans would not be something they could rely on?
Right. So I do think we have to, as we develop these technologies and as the Chinese do, we do have to think about how we would also defend against them. And here again, I think there's ample room for innovation. I think there's a lot of interesting research and development going on in the area of directed energy and electric weapons. If some of the particularly electric weapons for ship defense, if these are borne out, and it's going to take some time, these are not around the corner, but if these are borne out over the coming years, could fundamentally change the basic cost calculus of offense and defense, and give the defense a real advantage in terms of much lower cost, high magazine, ability to defend our ships at sea who would otherwise be vulnerable.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, you've all referenced the military-civil fusion between the PRC and Chinese businesses. So for any one of you, the Chinese are paying close attention to the DOD's outreach to innovative, agile companies in the private sector, which sometimes rely on venture capital. And last month, Michael Brown, director of the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit, said he discovered that the Chinese were tied up in 15% of all venture capital deals. So how should the Department of Defense handle relationships with private sector companies that are using venture capital with this as a possible source of influence by the Chinese or subterfuge by the Chinese? Any one of you?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this gets an issue I've focused on for a while, which is the opacity of a lot of the financial arrangements that go on in some of these mergers and acquisitions and investments, because private equity funds may be based in one country, but fundamentally the money is coming from somewhere else. And in many cases, we don't know that information. It's knowable. We can require them to report it. And so if a transaction comes into the CFIUS process, the government usually is probably, I would expect them to be successful in obtaining that information. But because there is a lot of voluntary compliance in the CFIUS system, the concern is there could be transactions going on that we simply don't know about, that don't come into the process and don't get that level of scrutiny. And so I do think that is a core issue with the increase in a lot of these big hedge funds and private equity and sovereign wealth funds, is we don't have good understanding of where the money's coming from. And I don't have enough expertise on the financial side to know exactly what the right solutions there are, but the problem is very clear.
Ms.
So
Flournoy?
if I could just add, I absolutely agree we have to know where the money's really coming from, but we also have to make distinctions between entirely passive investment that's just interested in a good return on investment. The vast majority of Chinese funding in Silicon Valley through venture capital is passive return on. It's a good way to make return on investment, better than the stock market, right? But we need to be able to find, are there cases where it's something else? They are getting a board seat. They are getting a controlling interest. They are getting a decision-making right, set of decision-making rights. They are getting access to non-public intellectual property. Those are the cases that we absolutely want to use CFIUS to restrict. But if we don't make that distinction, you're going to cut off a huge amount of blood flow in our own innovation ecosystem that does no damage because it's completely passive. So this is where we have to use the scalpel, not the sledgehammer, be nuanced in our understanding.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my 3 seconds.
Thank you. And Doug, you get the gold star for the day. You got it done on time. Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Flournoy, thank you very much for being here. It's great to see you, and I want to talk a little bit about reestablishing a credible deterrence, which you said is the #1 priority that we have with China. Now, it's just refreshing my memory as to how many nuclear warheads our countries possess. America has 6,184, according to armscontrol.org. China has 290. That's a big difference. We have about 21 times as many warheads as China. It's also a huge investment, and it's an investment that we are reinvesting in to the tune of trillions of dollars, which is something that to some degree we have to do. But I'm curious, how effective is this deterrence against China?
I think nuclear deterrence for both sides puts the specter of escalation to nuclear conflict on the table, and that is useful. But unfortunately, I think China has been consistently testing us as to what level of coercion, aggression, provocation can I get away with without the U.S. responding militarily? And they've been pushing the bar higher and higher and higher. And so my worry is they might miscalculate and think, I can take Taiwan back by force, and the U.S. isn't going to respond because, they've shown, so I'm talking about conventional deterrence. I think we have strong deterrence at the nuclear level.
So just
we may have overkill at the nuclear
well, just to
level.
put
We
this
probably
in
do.
concrete terms, has 29 times as many nuclear warheads as China stopped them from building islands in the South China Sea?
No,
Has
it
it
hasn't.
stopped them
It's
from
really, It's a
stealing-
question of whether it would stop us from going to all-out conflict.
Right, and I
put
understand.
each
Has it
other's
stopped them
homelands at
from
risk.
stealing
Yeah, no.
our intellectual
No.
property?
Nuclear deterrence is, I think nuclear weapons are for deterring other nuclear weapons.
So
and
if I
that's-
look at this chart,
and to
Russia
make us
has
hesitate to get on the escalation ladder to war.
right. So Russia has 6,490 nuclear warheads. I happen to be a member of Congress who thinks that Russia is an enemy of the United States, and they are doing things to try to undermine our democracy. We need to have those weapons to deter Russia. I get that.
Yeah. And they also added deterrent benefit for other nuclear powers that might consider using nuclear weapons. But I don't.
But I don't see how we're
think it's
making the mark with the
I don't think China is the sizing mechanism for our nuclear arsenal.
Right, but this is the problem. This is the problem. If China is our #1 adversary, and our #1 investment in deterrence is nuclear weapons, then I just don't see how we're making the mark. So what kinds of investments do we need to make to deter China, not just to deter Russia?
Well, I think we have to try to keep nuclear weapons and deterrence in the background, and we need to make only the investments that are necessary to keep a safe, secure, and effective deterrent, and no more. We need to use arms control to try to keep the constraints on or drive them lower, because any dollar that we spend more on nuclear capabilities we don't need is taking away from the investments we should be making in the conventional deterrence and the emerging technologies that will really make the difference.
So what kinds of other
preventing war.
transformative deterrence structures or technologies can we make to actually be effective at deterring China?
No, I
not
think,
just
and
Russia?
this is where I think in the near term, it is looking at concepts of operations and tweaks in thinking asymmetrically to say, how do we impose costs on China that will prevent them from launching an act of aggression? I gave the one example of holding their fleet at risk, but we went to school on the Soviet Union. We've all read the books that were written about how to deter the Soviet leadership. We have not gotten inside the Chinese leadership, their strategic calculus, with enough precision and depth of understanding to know how do we really affect their cost calculus in the near term with what we have and in the long term with what we're investing in. That's the work, and in my mind, most of that, if not all of that, is non-nuclear in
it's
nature.
extraordinary to me, for example, how much money, effort, time, government resources they're putting into controlling their population.
Yes.
The Uyghurs, for example.
Right.
What is our deterrence strategy vis-a-vis that clear critical vulnerability?
Right. Well, it also means deterrence is not just military. You have to think about how are we using our political influence, our ability to compete economically. We haven't even talked about One Belt, One Road and how we respond to that. How we use human rights violations and their record on that to constrain their influence more broadly. Those are all really important questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time was up. Mrs. Hartzler.
Sure. Well, it's great to have you all here and to see you again. Appreciate your expertise. Very important discussion. I would like to talk a little bit about the Chinese theft of sensitive U.S. military technology. Obviously, this is a very real concern, maintaining our competitive edge. China, as you know, has developed 2 fifth-generation fighter aircraft, the J-20 and the J-31, which draw amazing comparisons to our F-35. So in your opinion, is DOD doing enough to protect our 5th-generation capabilities from theft? And if not, what more should the department be doing?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the protections were inadequate in the past. I would not venture to say that we've solved the problem yet, but you're right. I mean, there were massive thefts of intellectual property and other information from U.S. defense industry and other parts of U.S. industry more broadly that the Chinese have taken advantage of. In my testimony, I mentioned shortcuts, and that was what I was alluding to. Have we tackled this problem? We have not. And it's a tough one because we often focus on the cyber threat and how this stuff can be stolen electronically, and that has absolutely occurred. But that is not the only way. The Chinese have obtained information by going into bankruptcy proceedings, getting access to, evaluating, being an acquirer. They can look at information about a company and then don't even have to acquire it. There's many, many avenues by which they have an ability to gain information about U.S. industry. But certainly cyber stands out as a critical one, and the department has this cybersecurity maturity certification that they're setting up, which is the right thing to do to make sure that industry focus on that. I do have some concerns about how that will be implemented, especially getting it stood up, that we don't end up forcing commercial companies out of our supply chain because they can't go through the hassle of getting the certification on the front end, and then end up declining to participate in our weapons systems programs because the certification is just not something that makes sense for them from a business perspective. I think some of those issues will settle out over time, but there's a real issue on the initial implementation that we need to pay attention to.
Anybody else want to share a little bit?
No, I would just add there's the human capital dimension as well. The 1,000 Talents program, which is sought to kind of recruit people recently retiring from industry to come over and lecture and spend time in China. There's been efforts to use academic research collaborations to get at sensitive technologies. And again, the scalpel, not the sledgehammer. There's a lot of flow. There's a lot of academic research collaboration in many fields that is actually, like health, that is actually beneficial to both countries. But in the areas where there is a national security application, we want to be really careful and look at the human capital dimensions of the problem as well.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was my next question. I have real concerns with some of the Chinese students that are coming into our country and doing high-level research at our universities and the potential threat that we have there. So you would suggest... What would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do, I think the vast majority of Chinese students coming are honestly not there for espionage. They're there because we have the best education system in the planet. In the past, we've done a really good job of recruiting the best and brightest to stay and become Americans and bring their talents here. Right now, our immigration policy is working against that, and that's, shooting ourselves in the foot. But I think we do have to do a better job of vetting, and we have to be very careful in terms of what kinds of work they're allowed to do, and where they're truly sensitive research that's going on. We want to make sure that we know exactly who's allowed into those labs.
Is that a State Department, just to follow up a little bit, is that a State Department vetting?
I think that it's got to happen more, helping universities have the tools to better understand the backgrounds of their students. But you may have ideas on this as well.
Yes, Admiral.
This past year, 2 years.
Could you? I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. This past year, the U.S.-China Security and Economic Review Commission looked at this problem, and in their I'm no longer on the commission, but in the annual report, it recommends two things. One, that the National Security Education Board, that was a higher education board that had been established in 2005, but was disestablished in 2018 by the director of the FBI, be reinstated, to take a look at this issue broadly, to talk to university presidents and what have you. And the other recommendation is that the GAO somebody needs to gather the data, quite frankly.
Somebody needs to be what?
Somebody needs to gather the data on how many students there are, how many are in STEM courses.
I'm sorry, again, we're gonna have to leave that there, general ladies over time, and we'll go
Anyway,
to
it's in the report.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you. I wanted to quote the 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission in saying that because gray zone challenges combine military and paramilitary measures with economic statecraft, political warfare, information operations, and other tools, they often occur in the seams between DOD and other U.S. departments and agencies, making them all the more difficult to address. Similarly, in February of 19, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral Davidson testified that, quote, "Our adversaries are pursuing their objectives in the space between peace and war, using fear and coercive actions across the instruments of national power to revise the rules-based international order without resorting to armed conflict. Alongside like-minded allies and partners, U.S. Indo-PACOM and the whole of U.S. government must compete in the gray zone between peace and war to win before fighting." I think the point being that it would be better to win this competition without a fight. China's gray zone activities, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, information ops, and broader and more involved military exercises, pose risks not only to us, but I think just as importantly to our regional partners, perhaps more so to our regional partners. So I wanted to ask the panel, in your assessment, what is the department doing well, and what else should it be doing, working with the whole of the U.S. government to better empower our regional allies, not only to compete but to push back against these coercive efforts that they're facing from China. What do they need from us in order to make this an easier competition for them?
I'll just say, I don't think it's a Department of Defense lead, actually. I think that this requires an integrated whole-of-government strategy. You know, first of all, we have to decide, where do we care to compete? You know, we're not going to counter every One Belt, One Road initiative, nor should we. But there are some that touch on our strategic interests, and there we need to think about what's our response. It's not going to, you know, maybe the Chinese are building, you know, a soccer stadium and a bridge to nowhere, but maybe we could go in with digital infrastructure that really helps a country join the sort of transparent, open information system that, frankly, will ultimately counter the Chinese influence that they're trying to exert through their construction projects. So we need to have a strategy, is my point. And then we need to look at what are the instruments we need to beef up. Most of them will be non-military, if not all of them, to really allow to be able to compete effectively where we need to.
And I would say I agree that DOD is not the locus within the U.S. government, nor should it be. But it is a player in the conversation. It is a participant. And I would say in some of our allied partner nations, it's much harder for their ministries of defense or their military to be involved. Their governments just aren't structured in a way that really supports that. So I think something DOD can do, working with partners and allies, is help them bring those national security perspectives into their own government conversations in a way that will help.
DOD actually does conduct our own sets of gray zone operations. If you listen to what the Chinese say, our reconnaissance flights around China in their EEZ that drives them crazy, we continue to do it. We continue to ignore their concerns about it, credibly. The State Department, or whoever coined the term debt trap diplomacy, was a great example of gray zone pushback, if you will, on BRI, and it caused China to really rethink the whole approach. And so it's not that it's all episodic, though. There is no central coordinating body. Obviously, that has to come out of the White House, the NSC or something.
Thank you. Obviously, the point being that we want to keep our allies in the region feeling confident in us as a partner and keep them in an alliance with us.
Absolutely.
Real quickly, I just wanted to point out to the committee, as we talk about deterrence, and everyone's always thinking about hypersonics, about Navy ships, what's the fleet of the future look like. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, has put out a white paper where he's talking about pivoting the Marine Corps back to naval expeditionary purpose that it was its original mission, and one that it's not been focused on for some time. And he has specifically said that he wants to build a force that can facilitate sea denial and assured access in support of fleet and joint operations. I think that is a likely potential successful deterrent if we support that pivot, and I hope we'll have some opportunity to talk about it in this committee in the year ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel for being here. We're finally getting to the issue that I want to talk about more, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. What some refer to as the debt trap diplomacy, what I refer to as the recolonization of Africa and other parts of the world through payday lending schemes orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party. And Admiral McDermott, you wrote in your testimony, it's difficult to overstate the important role that BRI plays in enhancing Chinese influence globally. In the case of BRI, seaport enhancement projects stretch from Greece to Malaysia. I've been to Djibouti. I've been to several of the countries in that part of Africa. I've also been to West Africa. Secretary Flournoy, the one thing I would add to your statement is that when you talked about Indo-Pacific and the partnership need there, I would simply add Africa to that as well. And perhaps it's just that I've spent more time there than I have in the Indo-Pacific. But I no longer believe that China is interested in operating in universally accepted global interest, as some believed, some didn't believe that when their economy took off that they would be good stewards. But I want to ask you. There's the debt trap diplomacy, what I refer to as the recolonization of vast areas of the world through the payday lending scheme, the BRI of Communist China. As we talk about other ways to build partnerships, one of the things that's being discussed right now is moving U.S. troops out of Africa. I've been with some of those U.S. troops in Mali, Nigeria, in that Lake Chad Basin area. And MINUSA, which is the largest UN peacekeeping mission in the world, if I'm not mistaken, the one thing I remember very well from that trip is the discussion about the damage that China is doing throughout that part of the world with effectively using the Belt and Road Initiative to steal the country's assets, to steal country's assets without any benefit to the general public. What is the best way for the U.S. to, not just the U.S., but the globe, the rest of the world powers, to counter that in both Eastern Africa and Western Africa? And how do you counter it if you actually pull the U.S. troops out of there?
I'll take a stab at it. I do think, again, you need a whole of government approach. Some of the most powerful instruments will be USAID programs, OPIC programs to help incentivize private sector investment in areas we care about, the whole digital development initiative that's been started. So I do think those economic instruments, and particularly things focused on digital infrastructure, are very, very powerful tools that we are underutilizing. But I do think that where we have either interests, counterterrorism interests, or we found partners who actually want to take on the fight on their home soil, but they need some help, they need some training, they need some enablers, they need some support, that's a very cost-effective way for us to protect some of our interests and gain the political influence that comes with that, without putting our guys kind of on the very front lines of combat in areas where others are willing to step up. So I do think our troop presence, carefully tailored, makes a difference.
But would you agree that our troop presence is what allows USAID to operate and what allows other non-government
Depends on the area. In high conflict areas, it certainly is relevant. In others, less so. But we want to make sure it's integrated for sure in terms of looking at all the dimensions of strategy and how we approach individual countries.
My concern is that if we pull what amounts to a very small number of troops out of certain areas, that non-government organizations that provide services to the public, healthcare, education,
the security environment may not be.
Then they will not be there. And I would just point out, Admiral, that you accurately state, China has the ability to wreck their economies, talking about China's neighbors. If China would intentionally wreck an economy of one of their neighbors, then you can bet your bottom dollar they'll wreck the economy of a country in Africa. And we need to make sure that when it comes to trade agreements and other things, that we're providing some information that maybe less sophisticated countries need when they're engaging
and on that, gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Scott, for your questions. Mine are going to follow up largely on those questions as well, and largely be directed to Ms. Flournoy. I am also really curious, as a member of both this committee and also the Foreign Affairs Committee, specifically on the Asia and the Africa subcommittees, about if we have any real understanding of how the investment of China in Africa, what implications it has to our own national security. Has there been a sort of overall study or understanding of that we can reflect on, is my first question.
So I think there's been some great outside work. I know that my old think tank, CNAS, has done some very good work looking at this from a strategic perspective and making recommendations. I'm sure that others like CSIS have as well, and perhaps CNA, I don't know. So there's good think tank work out there that I would commend to you. But I think I do want to add that we do need a strategy. We need priorities. We can't counter it everywhere, nor should we. There's a very powerful tool we have in transparency. The more people understand the terms that China has imposed on some of these countries, the more wary that others will be in going down this road. So that transparency, advertising it, making sure people know what they're walking into, providing that technical assistance in some cases, that's very important.
And you touched a little bit on it with your conversation with Mr. Scott in terms of the fact that we can't necessarily respond directly to every single aspect of China's Belt and Road Initiative, but maybe we should be more strategic about how we respond. And you talked a little bit about the digital response as an example. Are there any other examples of those responses? Have we studied anything? Sir, you seem very interested in that.
I just read something this morning that one of the success stories of Japanese-U.S. cooperation is with Myanmar, Burma, and sitting down and talking with them and empowering them to renegotiate the deal that they had already made with China and vastly improve the financial implications for Burma. And those are the sorts of things that we have been trying to do piecemeal around the world, where people are willing to listen. The truth of the matter is, as I put in my testimony, given the fact of Chinese largesse, no questions asked lending, and what have you, they have a whole bunch of people around the world that are willing to toe the line on Taiwan and Tibet and Xinjiang and not do anything to upset the Chinese in order to keep that no questions asked funding flowing to keep their internal developments going. And so China shows up with a credit card and a full billfold, and it's very difficult for countries that can't get the money anywhere else.
I just add, though, the big point here, I think, is we shouldn't be doing this alone. We should be doing this with our allies who have this very shared interests in this area, where we can put together a coalition with the Japanese, the Australians, the Koreans, others who can collectively fund alternatives or will be have a much better chance of competing successfully.
And with my remaining time, I was wondering if you all had any comment on what the implications of our current combat operations and our current movement in the Middle East has towards our posture towards China. Are you worried about that at all as we, the strategy of the current administration was to look to China and Russia and now seems to be going somewhere else?
There's only so many ships, can be only so many places, and every time you have a large naval buildup or an Air Force buildup in the Middle East, those are the same rotational forces that could be assigned to the Western Pacific or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific that aren't there.
It's also a matter of mind share and senior leader bandwidth. These crises, wipe everything else off the agenda. And so, Secretary Esper was out in the Reagan Forum saying my number one priority is China, China, China. When he has a week like he had last week, he's not spending a lot of time on China. And because, so I think there are real costs in both resources and in mind share, and what we need right now is a lot of creative thinking about Asia.
Thank you. And Mr. Hunter, do you have anything?
Well, let me just say briefly on the kind of the Africa point that I think there is a strong role actually for DOD engagement there, although I agree that it's a whole of government problem and the ally point. But we do have to be careful because when we work with partner military organizations in Africa, there is a possibility, a potential that can lead to coups and other things. Where I think we've had a lot of success is with the department's logistical capacity. So when we've gone to Africa and helped with the healthcare emergencies they've had, because we can bring in medical supplies, and that logistical capacity through things like LOGCAP can be really helpful.
Thank you. And I've run out of time and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Flournoy, I wanted to drill down on a particular emerging technology, and that is artificial intelligence. We've worked very hard to encourage and mature the Joint AI Center, to have a more comprehensive strategy from the department. Can you give your assessment on the JAIC? And I also want your recommendation. I'm going to visit the JAIC pretty soon here, and what questions, if you were me, would you ask of folks when I do visit the JAIC?
So I think that General Shanahan has done a fantastic job of creating something meaningful out of nothing, and under initially severe funding constraints, and I applaud the additional funding that you have been putting into the organization as it matures. I think that the JAIC has a lot of promise. I think it's very, very important to informed setting of common standards and ethical principles, policies, and set priorities for what we're doing in AI across the department. I think one of the biggest things you may ask about is what kind of senior and tech and mid-level kind of program manager kind of tech talent do they need, and what could Congress do to better support them accessing that talent? Very hard to take someone who's never managed a software development program, who comes from a traditional acquisition background, put them in that role for 2 years and expect them to be successful. So there's a training component, there's a attracting talent component, there may also be a financial component, but I think at this point the long pole in the tent is getting the right talent. You now have a fantastic CTO who's incredibly well regarded in Silicon Valley. Him being there will attract people to come want to work for him, but we need to make it a lot easier and reduce some of the obstacles to getting that talent.
Thank you for that. Switching to cybersecurity and a technical question, and this is again for Secretary Flournoy. Are there any discussions or concerns about the potential installation of Chinese optical fiber and related Chinese photonic components in a DOD network or through our private contractors who are contracted to work with the DOD network? I see folks nodding their heads, so if others want to answer.
Short answer is yes, and I think this is where we need to really scrub any dependency we have on any Chinese supplies and parts. Some may not matter, it may be fine. Some of them are really not okay at all and could be very compromising either, from any number of perspectives. But if there are others who've looked at this more closely and want to comment, I'm happy to let you do so.
I would just say that the undersea cable networks that connect the world are all privately owned. There are no state-owned, and these are private contractors who are building this. And so, yeah, we're liable to wind up with Chinese optical and Chinese material that's in some of these cables that are being laid. And I honestly don't know what the fix is, but if the material itself creates a situation where that data could be stolen or interrupted, that would have huge financial implications for the world.
And I just have a slight time left, so I'm going to jump in here. We've touched upon the importance of allies and partnerships. And as we think about countering the One Belt, One Road initiative, when we think about countering China's significant state investment in emerging technologies, I believe that one of our greatest strengths is those partnerships and working with our closest allies. I look at the effective R&D that we've pursued between the U.S. and Israel, for example. What are specific initiatives that you would recommend we make investments in, and with which particular countries? Because they're countries that are leading in different sectors.
Yeah, so one recommendation, it may or may not require legislation, but we have developed these OTA arrangements which have the potential to be incredibly useful for working with allied and partner nations and national champions or technology leaders in other countries. But I am unaware as of yet that there is an OTA consortium that includes a foreign firm. I think we should have those. We should have purpose-built OTA consortia so we can work on those kinds of issues with partner nations where they have leading firms in the key technologies.
Thank you, Secretary Flournoy. 15
I would
seconds.
just add, I do think that in each of the technology sectors, we want to identify who are the leading allied technology partners and seek to use things like OTAs and other funding authorities to try to really leverage their assistance and have some more in the way of joint projects.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Brindisi?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Building on some of the questions regarding investments in information technology, I'm particularly concerned about DOD keeping pace. Keeping pace with China in terms of our investment in information technology, specifically quantum sciences. It's been fairly well documented that information warfare is a core strength of the People's Liberation Army, and in recent years, China has aggressively invested and increased the pace of its quantum research. It's been publicly reported that China has surpassed the United States in many areas of quantum research, which is deeply troubling because there's no doubt that early adopters of quantum technologies will gain significant military advantages. For example, quantum computing could be used for more effective artificial intelligence algorithms, highly secure encryption of communications to defend against hacking, and accurate navigation that does not require GPS signals. So, Secretary Flournoy, I'm worried that we are slightly slow to fully recognize the massive importance of quantum technologies and invest accordingly. Do you feel we are investing adequate resources fast enough in order to keep pace with China regarding quantum information science research?
I'll say I have not looked at this at the level of detail that I can definitively answer that question, but I do think this is an area where we absolutely must compete. I think DOD, using its own research and development monies, has a role to play, but I also think we need to be using things like tax incentives and civilian R&D, university research R&D, to try to pull more effort from both universities and the private sector into this area, because I agree with your assessment. It's absolutely critical that this is an area where we keep our edge.
Any other?
Yeah, I would add, quantum is really hard. I think there's a general perception, when you look at these key technologies that are identified in the NDS, they're all important. Some of them are much more near term than others. And I would probably say of those, quantum is more of a reach than some of the others. Having said that, I also think in that respect, DOD's role here could be larger, because I think it's going to take some time for the VC sector and others to really see the kind of return on investment they're looking for in these technologies. So there's an opportunity for DOD to take a leadership role and shape the development of the technology globally and in the United States. And that's something we should seize on. That doesn't necessarily require a massive investment of dollars, but it does involve a commitment and having a clearly identified research community within the United States with DOD involvement to push forward on that.
I would just say that I wish my 15-year-old grandson was here, because he is really into quantum. I don't understand what he's talking about. But no, seriously.
Maybe he can educate me,
that
too.
That really is. I was a history major. Give me a break.
Me too.
But the reality is, this really is something that China is putting an incredible amount of effort into. And so they see great advantages to taking the lead in this. So this is one that I think that we definitely do not want to find ourselves behind the power curve.
I know you mentioned the NDS. The 2018 National Defense Strategy outlines that we must prioritize research and development of emerging technologies like quantum science, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. China seems to have taken a much more whole-of-society approach than we are. China's military-civil fusion program seeks to explicitly foster ties between the military and civilian enterprises in order to improve military technology, drive innovation, and foster economic growth. China is showing a clear commitment to investing heavily in game-changing technologies like AI, machine learning, quantum computing. And while I'm encouraged by recent steps in the right direction that we've taken, I also believe that the United States needs to double down on its commitment to develop these technologies before our adversaries. Mr. Hunter, part of my reason for my amendment to create a new Quantum Information Sciences Innovation Center in this year's NDAA was to foster these collaborative relationships in order to accelerate quantum research. Do you believe there's an adequate amount of collaboration on the research and development of quantum, AI, and machine learning technologies across the different departments, industry and academia currently?
I would want to maybe distinguish between quantum and AI in that. I think there's more we can and should be doing in AI. On quantum, I think we have been pretty proactive, but by we I mean the U.S. government and the Department of Defense has been pretty proactive, working with the key industry players and being aware. That doesn't mean we should stop or that we don't need, and then I would also add the international piece to this, because, the Australians have quite a bit of capability with quantum, and we can leverage our alliances there to help as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Biometric identifiers such as fingerprints and facial recognition, DNA, retina, and other personal markers play an increasingly important role in military technological capabilities and threats. In December, the DOD issued a directive advising U.S. service members against using genetic testing kits such as 23andMe. The memo states, quote, "The test could expose personal and genetic information and potentially create unintended security consequences and increase risk to the joint force and mission," end quote. So whether it's TikTok or facial recognition apps on an iPhone or 23andMe DNA testing kits, Ms. Flournoy, what could the possible national security implications be if an adversary like China gained access to the genetic makeup of our U.S. service members?
I think the risk is that the development of bioweapons or potential bioweapons is moving into the realm of using genetically modified approaches. So if there were significant genetic differences between, say, the American population in general and the Chinese population in general, and something could be designed that would, be very damaging to an American, but, a Chinese person would be relatively more protective or less susceptible or what have you, you could imagine going down that road. It sounds very sci-fi-like, but that is where the cutting edge of the research could go. I think in this country, there are ethical constraints and legal constraints on going there, but in other countries that may not be so. So I think that's what's, people are worried about is there information that we think is harmless today, but could be really misused in the future against us.
Mr. Hunter, could you maybe elaborate or speculate more on why the DOD wrote the memo advising our service members not to participate in Ancestry.com or 23andMe type genetic testing kits?
When you consider what could be done with this information, I think we all on a daily basis, you read the articles about the way in which we can all be tracked by people getting access to our cell phone information and the pings that our cell phones are sending out every day. And someone can completely map out your life. So from an espionage perspective, if you know where someone's spending all their time and first of all, you can go find them there. Secondly, you might discover things that would be personal reliability risk factors. If they have health issues, maybe in the family, maybe that's something that could be leveraged from an espionage threat perspective. And when it comes to genetic information, you're going to find out a tremendous amount about someone's family and their structure, and that could again pose a risk for being targeted for espionage.
Ms. Flournoy, in your opinion, is the DOD adequately resourced to counter China's biometric warfare efforts?
Honestly, I haven't looked at it to know, give you a good answer. I'm happy to look into that, but I think it's certainly an important area where both our intelligence community and our broader defense and national security community, we need to take care.
Mr. Hunter?
You're asking about biometrics with respect to, I'm sorry, just repeat.
Are we adequately addressing this threat, and what can we do to better resource the DOD to battle back against it?
Yeah, well, I have to admit, when I think about biometrics, it's usually from the perspective of how we leverage it. We did a tremendous amount of use of biometrics in Afghanistan to try and understand who we were working with and to identify people coming on to U.S. FOBs. And so, a lot of the effort within DOD has been how to leverage that information, how to share that information, because it's really challenging to do all the data transfers necessary to actually, when someone walks through a door and you identify them, to get that information to the person who can do something about it if they're a threat. If you flip it around and say, what is the risk of Chinese technology being used to track and monitor U.S. personnel, I agree. That's one that I haven't spent as much time thinking about how we would get after that problem.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego?
Thank you. And Rear Admiral, you kind of hit up on this earlier. When Ambassador Harris was Admiral Harris, he advised the committee that the area in which we had the most significant dominance was an undersea domain. In an environment where our surface assets are threatened, is there a coherent strategy relying on those undersea assets to maintain deterrence?
Do you mean undersea? You mean submarines?
Yes.
Right now, at least on the 7th Fleet fact sheet that's on the internet, they say that on an average day, there are somewhere between 8 and 12 nuclear attack submarines in the Western Pacific. And in my testimony, I suggested that needs to be increased to, say, 10 to, or 12 to 15. And it would be useful, I think, to have 4 of them home ported in Japan. We have 4 in Guam and put 4 in Japan. At 20 knots, if a submarine leaves Pearl Harbor, it takes 9 days to get to the Taiwan Straits. And so that's a long time if you're looking to plus up the number of resources that you have there to deal with Chinese ships and what have you. So is there a strategy? Obviously, the Navy has a force assignment and allocation process in place, but is there a strategy based upon having how many submarines would we like to have on a day in and day out basis to be able to, as Ms. Flournoy said, sink the Chinese Navy?
But we'll get to that.
Then I'm sure I'm sure somebody knows what the answer is, but I'm sure it's also classified.
But Ms. Flournoy, yes. Can you expand? And I'm very interested in your idea in terms of the deterrent factor of, for example, sinking the Chinese Navy, but are we actually right-sized for that?
If I could just say, I also there is a big important set of force multipliers for the undersea competition, and that is new unmanned systems for ISR, for strike, for countermine, and particularly the larger, extra large UUVs. And this is a classic area where the Navy needs to be able to have some of these to experiment with, to develop concepts, and then procure at scale. But in terms of sinking, again, that was just one example. What I'm trying to get at is, you know, when we face or try to deter a nuclear power from going to war over their vital interest and something that we also care deeply about, but they may perceive that their interest is stronger than ours. What can we hold at risk credibly without necessarily, you know, walking up the nuclear escalation ladder? And so I think, and if you can hold at risk the very assets they would need to launch the aggression or carry it through, and that the costs to those assets would be quite not just tactical but strategic, then I think, you know, that is what we need to think about. I think if we develop some new operational concepts and made some tweaks, we do, you know, there are munitions we have today and platforms that we have today that if we were to make they're cross-service, but we could put them together in ways that would give us a near-term kind of interim solution or, you know, option, and there are probably others. So again, the really important part of this is funding the concept development and experimentation efforts, things like the SCO, that take really hard problems of the combatant commanders and say, I know maybe I'll solve it in 10 years when new technologies come, but I don't have that long. I got to solve it today and tomorrow in the next 5 years. How do I do that with what we have? And really put some serious effort behind those creative concept work and then technology tweaking and cross-service work to get to some of these solutions. The one I gave was just an illustrative example. I'm sure there are 100 other good ideas out there.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Waltz?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to set the table for a moment and to be very candid, I think we are in a new Cold War with China. They certainly have been with us for some time. I think the policies that we're seeing under President Xi has accelerated that dynamic. I don't think the United States in many ways across our whole of society has fully woken up to what Xi has explicitly stated he wants to go and where he wants to go in terms of global dominance. But if you look at how the UK essentially peacefully stepped aside as a global leader post-World War II, and the United States essentially made that a fait accompli, there is a large body of analysis out there that I've seen that essentially wants China or believes that China is going to follow that same model. So that if you look at what we're facing over the next 10 years, particularly right around 2030, Chinese military dominance on the cusp, if you buy into the fact that they plan to do this by 2035, our entitlements going upside down, our debt reaching 100% of GDP, if not sooner, their Navy larger than ours in quantity and possibly in some cases quality as well. So it really is a perfect storm in many ways for them to make that essentially a fait accompli, for the United States to begin sharing, if not stepping back from the world order that I think many take for granted. So going back to a deterrence model and what we can do now, between now and then, Ms. Flournoy, or really for the entire panel, what would be more of a deterrent? Getting inside the Chinese thinking, what they fear the most. Is it things like, for example, a free Hong Kong, the Uyghurs and its western and on its western flank, so to speak, and its western boundary, a rearmed Japan, denial to our capital markets, a unified Korea? Are those things, what would deter Chinese behavior and aggression more? Things like that, or a few more submarines in the Western Pacific? Because I would argue, I'm probably showing my cards, that it would be the former, not the latter. And I completely agree with you, Ms. Flournoy, in counting ships and counting planes, one isn't the right metric. But number two, it's not one on the current economic paths that both countries are on that we can win. So I think a lot of this back and forth today has been great and illustrative, but I don't know that this committee is really thinking about, or frankly, the administration, the American society is really thinking about this in the right way and in a creative way, and I'd welcome your thoughts on that kind of premise.
Yeah, this is why I started my testimony by saying I realize this is the HASC and we're focused on military dimensions of deterrence, but this is a whole of government and a whole of nation challenge. And the Communist Party cares about one thing, which is staying in power in China. Period.
The Iranian regime.
And yes, and so there are lots of ways that we can help them to be very preoccupied internally, and also that we can use their missteps in places like Hong Kong, or if they were to overreach in Taiwan, to mobilize the world to push back on their coercion and their aggression. I think, again, this is not, we have to think in terms of allies and partners. The U.S. trying to counterbalance China and constrain China's negative behaviors is much harder than us rallying other like-minded states, democracies, who want to push back on authoritarian systems in general, and certainly don't want a world order in Asia that's defined by Chinese coercion.
Completely agree. And just in the interest of time, if there's any hard recommendations, I'm also on the Science and Technology Committee, and we are wrestling with, on the one hand, dramatically increasing our authorizations and investments. On the other hand, not using those investments then, or finding ourselves in a situation where those investments are essentially supplementing the Chinese, who are taking advantage of our very necessary openness. So how do we, on the one hand, make those investments that we need, keep it open enough, but also block and tackle that running, those then new technologies running right over to Beijing? I'm talking National Science Foundation, NIST, those other areas that frankly, from a cultural standpoint, have not really kind of bought on to this threat.
Thank you. We're going to have to stop it there, and I know that you've been adding to those questions along the way. Thank you. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much to our panel for being here this morning. Really appreciate your time. I've learned a lot through our discussion today. I was especially interested in your opening, Secretary Flournoy, where you talked about how part of what would make us stronger in terms of our competitiveness against China is investing in ourselves, investing in our R&D, investing in STEM. Mr. Hunter, you talked about the challenges in our workforce with regard to so many foreign students. And coming from a university where I get to boast that the vast majority of our STEM university graduates are American citizens ready for clearance, we see the competition with other universities where there are a lot of foreign students, and so it makes it more challenging, obviously, because of the clearance issue. Now, with regard to your testimony, Ms. Flournoy and Mr. Hunter, you all mentioned the need for flexibility in contracting when it comes to new technology and smaller innovative companies. Can you both share your perspective on whether efforts like Army Futures Command are hitting the mark? Also, are we doing enough to support the vast array of technologies and competencies like advanced materials manufacturing facilitated by 3D printing? And finally, is Congress providing the necessary support for this agility? If not, what else can we do? I know that's a lot of questions, tried to squeeze them in. And then, Admiral, if you have anything to add, I would appreciate your thoughts as well.
Yeah, on Army Futures Command, to my mind, it is still fairly nascent, which is not a critique because it takes time to establish a four-star command. I am highly encouraged by the work done by the cross-functional teams. I think it's, there are 6 of them, and so my last count, maybe could be updated. And so I think they're not all the same, right? They aren't all achieving the same things. Most familiar with the Future Vertical Lift, CFT, Vertical Lift Aviation, because we've done some work with them, where I think they have come up with some very creative approaches to make a generational shift to a next generation of technology. And I think that the work that the CFTs have been doing is what I right now think of as what Army Futures Command is accomplishing, and I think a lot of it is very positive. I hope that we reach an outcome where the CFTs and the goodness that they've brought to the Army's modernization program is sustained and brought forward by Army Futures Command and not supplanted by Army Futures Command and the structures that it puts in place. And I do have to say, the Army has been the leader in the use of other transaction authority agreements. So they have been on the cutting edge of these more flexible tools for reaching out to non-traditional partners, and they deserve full credit for that. So on the whole, I would give it a pretty good grade at the moment, but we still have to keep our eye and to make sure that the bureaucracy doesn't kind of solidify around some of what they've been doing. On additive technologies, I do know, I think that is still a huge area of opportunity for the Department of Defense. I think the capabilities that additive brings really suit very well to military missions. The example a lot of folks talk about is having a 3D printing machine on a carrier where they can print parts and not have to go back into port or ship them out. The military applications are really, really well tailored to that technology.
Thank you.
In following up on your question in the spirit of Representative Thornberry's request for concrete proposals, so this committee has done an incredible job of seeding lots of authorities, types of support to try to spur the department to innovate. I think what we need now is a couple of efforts to kind of really assess what's working, what's not. I would love to see like an end-to-end analysis to sort of say, if you're a small company and you start with a cyber contract in the Air Force, then you get an OTA to prototype, then you, like almost an end-to-end, how do this patchwork fit together into a path that a small that's repeatable and that companies can be successful moving down? Where are the gaps? Where do they, in practice, where are they falling through the cracks? Where are they stumbling and getting disconnected? Where are they, so to really assess, put it all together as a journey, because that's what the experience is for these companies. And how do we help them make the full journey, those that are successful? The other thing is sort of traditional management consulting, portfolio analysis. again, lots of things have been tried. Sometimes, in some cases, it's too early to assess whether Futures Command is succeeding. But can we start doing some regular portfolio analysis by this committee to say, what is actually working out there? Where are the wins? And how do we double down and start scaling those? And if it's happening in one service, how do we get it across all the services?
Thank you,
and
Ms.
so forth.
Flournoy.
Yeah.
I think we really do want to put that piece together. I appreciate it. Mr. Whitman?
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you to the panel members, too, for joining us today. Admiral McDevitt, I'd like to begin with you and follow up on your written testimony where you talk about the track for the Chinese Navy and where it'll be in 2035 with essentially 420 ships, about 260 of those blue water ships, the other 160 various other types of ships. Again, I'm pretty taken aback by that, 420 ships. That's pretty significant Navy, and that doesn't include various auxiliary ships, minesweepers, smaller amphibious ships. In fact, to put that in perspective, just this last Sunday, as you know, the Chinese commissioned a Type 055 Renai-class destroyer. Now, that's on par with our cruisers, and they're going to be using that to support carrier strike groups. And we saw recently they commissioned their second aircraft carrier, the Shandong, who allegedly can support 36 fighter aircraft. So they're building quite a capacity. And if you look at where they are going with large transport ships, amphibious transport dock ships, with larger platform amphibious ships capable of carrying aircraft, they are on track not just to be a near-peer competitor and to be a pacing threat, but be one that we're going to be far behind as they are pushing with everything they've got to build a 420-ship Navy by 2035, and we're doing everything we can just to try to get to 355 ships, not to mention that the big sucking sound we're getting ready to hear in years to come out of the shipbuilding account is going to be Columbia-class, and certainly we need that, but that's $128 billion that would come right off the top in the shipbuilding account, and we'll have a discussion about that the other day about the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund and trying to not have the other shipbuilding programs be the bill payer for Columbia. But I want to go to Admiral Gilday's words yesterday at the Surface Navy Association. He said, if we believe that we require overmatch in the maritime, if we believe that we're going to execute distributed maritime operations and operate forward in greater numbers now, that we need more iron, then we need more top line. And to this end, I ask you this, can we hope to keep up with the Chinese, our pacing threat, and not let them so surpass us that we have not the impact we need to deter in the Maritimes, if we continue down the road of the formula of 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 for our service branches, since in the future, or I would argue even today, the tip of the spear, that capability to be there on station, to be able to deter and to react and to act is there in the Maritimes with the Navy Marine Corps team, and no detriment towards our Army and Air Force brethren, but I just want to get your perspective on that.
You know, as a former naval officer, as a retired naval officer, one part of me is saying, "Hear, hear." But in truth, I think we need to not be too carried away by the numbers game with regard to the PLA Navy. I talked about the numbers game just to give some sort of a sense of how big the bread box is, quite frankly. But we also need to remember that the Navy we have and that we will have for the foreseeable future, you know, the ships that are here today or we're building tomorrow are going to be with us for another 30 years or so, is we still have a qualitative advantage. We may not have a numerical advantage, and certainly we don't know how well the Chinese ships actually are in terms of, can they maintain those things when they're out 6 months on deployment? Are their sailors really competent to do anything? Does the dual command arrangement, when we have a political officer and the commanding officer both of the same rank, how will that work when the chips are down, et cetera, et cetera? There's lots of uncertainties here. And so clearly, I think I didn't hear what the CNO said yesterday at the Surface Navy Association, but I do know that the U.S. Navy is really terrified by the prospect of having a hollow Navy.
Yeah.
And so whatever they need, whatever size Navy we wind up with, it ought to be fully resourced and ready, and not be something that is we can't. I lived through a hollow Navy, and where you can't maintain the ships, where you don't have enough sailors, the spare parts are non-existent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yes.
Just
Mr. Hunter?
two thoughts. I mentioned in my testimony, my written testimony, that shipbuilding is an area where the Chinese have made incredible progress. And to my eye, it is directly tied to the fact that they have a commercial shipbuilding industry that is world class. They're world leaders in that area, and so it's perfectly logical that it's the reinforcing function. Why I say you have to pay attention to the economic commercial side of the ledger. And secondly, on budget share, I would just say if you look at contract data and budget data, not to say that the Navy has exactly the right share today, but I am not as concerned now as I used to be that the services will all just get a third, because it has changed quite a bit in the last 5 years. And the Department of Navy actually has done well.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Madam Chair. What an insightful and informative discussion today. So I want to thank Admiral McDevitt and Director Hunter, Secretary Flournoy for being here today and sharing with us your thoughts on DOD's role in competing with China. We've talked a lot about modernization and procurement, force structure, technology, AI, quantum computing, a lot of things, the impact on the budget. I want to kind of shift a little bit to sort of current and near-term allocation of resources, deployment of forces, ISR, intelligence, ground forces. And let me just start with a statement that General Votel offered a year ago in his posture statement. As you know, former CENTCOM commander. He says, "We recognize the U.S. is rightly shifting its resources toward Europe," he's thinking Russia, "and East Asia," he's thinking China, to balance great power competition, but remain mindful that the CENTCOM AOR represents a geopolitical crossroads and a principal zone for that competition as well. We saw, and I think there was a question when I was out of the room, that the Pentagon is eyeing a drawdown in Africa. I visited AFRICOM. There's some collective anxiety about their troop strength and their role in great power competition. I visited SOCOM recently. They're sort of creatively describing their mission to meet both the counter-VEO effort, which they spend a lot of time and they do a great job, but how they also play a role in great power competition. And if you've had the same experience I have, when they try to articulate that, they're struggling a little bit. So I guess the question is, what is the intersection of our requirement to counter violent extremist organizations and to take on great power competition? Sometimes there seems to be, it's an either or. Once we sort of settle the violent extremist organizations and we minimize that threat, which we mostly see in CENTCOM, but we know it's in Africa, it's in the Indo-Pacific, then we'll even have more resources to modernize and take on China and Russia. Can you share with me some thoughts about the intersection at today, current allocation of resources and assets, and how the counter-VEO threat enables us to compete with China? Anybody?
I'm going to tee up Ms. Flournoy, former Secretary Flournoy, because what you're talking about really in terms of the department is having to balance risk. You have to make a decision, since there's never going to be enough money to do everything. There just won't be. So the question is, where are you willing to, if you will, disinvest or take troops out of Africa or wherever it is, where you think you can accept that risk and take those resources and apply them somewhere else? And so people like former Undersecretary Flournoy are the ones that have to make decisions on how do you accept that risk.
I used to advise my boss, and he would make the decisions. But no, I do think that we need, after 20 years or almost 20 years, we do need to sort of take a strategic look at countering violent extremism, not only from a military perspective, but from other tools, and to really assess, which of these groups directly threaten the United States and the United States homeland, which of them threaten important allies and partners, and we want to assist them in dealing with, building their capacity and dealing with them. And which of these are really, really nasty groups, but frankly, it's more important to use our resources we would use to cover down on them, say in the Special Operations Community, instead to regrow the kinds of Cold War skill sets that Special Operations had in terms of, what are they going to do vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So in a great power competition, the special ops becomes very important in the gray zone. They become very important in any kind of irregular warfare or use of proxies. They become very important if it actually came to some kind of confrontation, behind the lines and in the shadows and so forth. Those are skill sets that community has not really trained and practiced on and used for decades now. And so they have a very big challenge to start re-exercising some of those muscle groups while also keeping a lid on counterterrorism and CVO, because we count on them for that. And that threat's not going away, even if we're willing to manage some risk in that area.
If I could just add, having been in the Pentagon when we had 150,000 plus troops overseas, and we might have a daily variation of 5,000 troops in theater from day to day. I am always a little puzzled by having, really intense discussion about 1,000 troops in this location. It's just, to me, it's a little overblown. Not to discount the, the mind share issues that have been brought up. And I would also say when it comes to Africa, it's the fastest, economically the fastest growing continent and likely to be so for some time to come. The Chinese are making a huge strategic play for it. So I don't see a U.S. return on investment, if you will, by pulling out from there in a meaningful way. That doesn't mean you can't adjust. But.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you all. I want to thank Mr. Smith, Mr. Thornberry for bringing this together. I think there are a long list of people that were here throughout the morning, and it's been very informative. I can assure you we want to follow up on a number of these issues, and thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much.
Meeting's adjourned.